Thank you, Jenny, Irina, and everyone here for the invitation. Guten Morgen. Good morning. Buenos dias. So I'm going to present to you some questions about museums in relationship to community-based art practices. And one of the case studies I'm going to show you deals with a curatorial project I was involved in. The Museo de Antioquia in Medellin, Colombia. The museum had been under the leadership of Lucia Gonzalez, who was director of the museum between 2005 and 2011. And so I'm going to begin by proposing a conversation around certain terms that I'm borrowing from my friend Stephen Wright. One of the terms that I'm going to bring up is the question of extradisciplinarity. I'm showing you an image of the Chilean-born economist, Manfred Max Neef. And I'm going to read to you a quote from an interview he did for television. He says, I worked for about 10 years in areas of extreme poverty in the Sierras. Sierras are mountain ranges. In the jungle and urban areas of Latin America. And one day, at the beginning of that period, I found myself in an Indian village in the Sierra in Peru. It was an ugly day. It had been raining all day, and I was standing in the slum. And across from me, a guy was standing in the mud. He was a short guy, thin, hungry, jobless, 5 kids and a wife and a grandmother. And I was the fine economist from Berkeley. As we looked at each other, I suddenly realized that I had nothing coherent to say to that man in those circumstances, that my whole language as an economist was absolutely useless. Should I tell him that he should be happy because the GDP had grown 5% or something? Everything felt absurd. Economists study and analyze poverty in their nice offices. They have all the statistics, they make all the models, they are convinced they know everything, but they don't understand poverty. I bring up this quote and the image of Manfred Max Neef. He's well known for realigning the discipline of economics and his own study around poverty in Latin America by moving away from macro scale indicators like GDP to micro scale indicators, or what he calls human scale indicators. Access to water, access to family, education, etc. His learning process as an economist meant vastly diversifying the ecology of knowledge he had at his disposal, expanding the boundaries of what he understood as the discipline of economics by working outside of his discipline. This concept of extradisciplinarity, of course you understand interdisciplinarity, right? You have, let's say, architecture and sociology and you develop something in the middle. The concept of extradisciplinarity is defined by Stephen Wright as one where you're actually working in knowledge, not policed or disciplined by disciplinary institutions. I'm going to show you the case study of a group of architects from Brazil. They had met at the University of Rio de Janeiro, the University of Sao Paulo, and they're a collective called Bijari, formed about 12 years ago. As architects, they research social conditions on the ground. They study gentrification, housing justice, the history of developmentalism, and economic history in Latin America. And I had invited them to work in Medellin in 2011. When they came, they were immediately drawn to this neighborhood that lies underneath that cable metro system that leads up into the mountains surrounding the city of Medellin and up into this very large structure, this library park called Biblioteca Parque España. This large library park is one of 5 existing sort of large library park systems in the city of Medellin. There's 5 more currently being constructed. And they developed, and they came to be conceived around the late 1990s as a way to think about remediating and speaking back to the existing violence in Medellin. As you'll remember, 1993, the famous Pablo Escobar gets killed. Medellin descends into even more violence, at that time being famously labeled as the most violent city in the world. And architects, urban planners start to think about, and the government start to think about ways to address this issue. One of them was the restructuring of their tax code that funneled massive amounts of money towards education programming that helped pay for these large structures. These library park systems address everything from community filmmaking, prenatal care, dance projects for the elderly, and everything in between. They've also become a site for tourism. People come to Medellin now and take these cable car systems and overlook the poverty below and arriving at these structures. This one was done by the Italian architect Giancarlo Mazzanti in 2008. So Bijari came, and as architects, as I said, they were interested in the social conditions of the ground and understood that knowledge had to arise from the community and from the ground up. They began by addressing the community in rooftop meetings, workshops and negotiations with community leaders to try to get a sense of the history of how this neighborhood was founded. And one of the interesting things about it is that through these series of conversations, they began to realize that they could actually trace the founding of that neighborhood that was developed back in the 60s and the 70s through 2 or 3 moments of specific violence that was happening in the countrysides of Colombia that then led to massive migration and exile and the founding of this community. I'm going to show you a little clip now of documentation of that research. You're going to hear a term, or you'll read a term they said invasion. That term is actually a term that speaks about people fleeing the countryside and creating informal settlements around the central part of the city, what we would in English call favelas, no?
Santo Domingo Sabio tiene una historia muy hermosa que es la supervivencia y la existencia del barrio desde el momento en que se inició la invasión en el año 1964, que yo soy de esa historia, de cómo se inició la invasión, lo que ha sufrido la gente para sobrevivir en este barrio. Eso es muy hermoso. Sí, Santo Domingo tiene una historia muy bonita y lo más importante la forma como ha evolucionado desde el 64 hasta el 2011 y la forma en que ha progresado tan inmensamente.
Nosotros venimos a este barrio hace 43 años que vivo yo me crié aquí en Medellín. Esto era selva, los caminos trochitas, en el año 60, 70. Y esto era trocha, nosotros nos quedamos aquí descalzos, las casitas eran de tierra, de una tierra amarilla. El piso era de tierra, todo. Y ya el hombre fue avanzando pues a hacer las calles, a hacer las casas de material. Nosotros vivimos en una casita de tablas. Y vivimos muy felices acá en este barrio, a pesar de tantas cosas que suceden, malas y buenas, pero somos felices acá y nos sentimos muy bien. Yo fue una invasora. Yo vivía en San Antonio del Prado y como yo no tenía dónde vivir, el doctor ya me dijo, consigo dónde vivir, entonces yo no sabía para dónde salía, entonces yo me di cuenta que por aquí había una invasión. Entonces yo me vine a invasión, a invadir.
Let's advance to the next one, to the next point. Yeah.
Yo creo que acá lo que más se basa en eso. Acá unas veces es tranquilo, otra vez uno vive con angustias. Entonces me parece que sería una frase donde tenga que ver esas dos palabras, la angustia y la tranquilidad, que es lo que más manejamos acá, que es la inestabilidad, que unos meses bueno, otros meses feo, y así uno tiene que vivir de las buenas a las malas.
That says an unstable
Pues
tranquility.
la familia no es lo tanto, sino también la tranquilidad, porque es donde ahí manejamos todo lo que es la comunidad, los barrios,
I made
las
myself.
fronteras invisibles que tenemos acá.
It was made with our own hands.
Hablar de memoria, de nuestras historias.
What you see there on the banners of the rooftops are fragments of the narrative story of how people came and developed that community. And then fragments of those stories were placed on the homes of the people who said them. So as you took the funicular up to Parque España, you would go up, and as a work of concrete poetry, right, the narrative of the community unfolded, right? And as you return, it deconstructed. This type of work seems to me as an example of what Manfred Max Neef talks about human scale indicators, thinking about developmentalism, urban planning, history, from a human scale indicator, thinking about it from the ground up. And it's also an example of working outside the discipline of architecture, being extra-disciplinary. Here's another offer. Again, I'm going to credit Stephen Wright with bringing this up for me. This is Lewis Carroll, and I'm going to read to you a fragment from a book he wrote in 1883, Sylvia and Bruno Concluded. And it's a very little-known work of Lewis Carroll's. And in it, in the second volume, there's a section where this mysterious person named Mein Herr, who has a German accent, and this is pure coincidence, is being questioned about his knowledge of what he's learned from this host nation. And so the narrator asks, "What useful thing a pocket map is," I remarked. "That's another thing we've learned from your nation," said Mein Herr, "map making. But we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful? About 6 inches to the mile?" "Only 6 inches," exclaimed Mein Herr. "We very soon got to 6 yards to the mile. Then we tried 100 yards to the mile. And then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to the mile." "Have you used it much?" I inquired. "It has never been spread out," said Mein Herr. "The farmers object. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So we now use the country itself as its own map. And I assure you it does nearly as well." In this story, representation however close it gets to real life being the grandest idea of all, was not nearly as good. Only when it became the country itself, when it operated on the one-to-one scale, did things actually work out. These kinds of practices are generally not interested in institutional or performative capture, saying this is art. These types of practices work with representation, make videos, they do performative projects, make objects, but they are not necessarily representative of anything per se. They have a high coefficient of artistic competency, but they are happy not to be framed as art necessarily. And the participants, in this case architects from Brazil, are happy not to necessarily also to be framed as artists. Just as an aside, that's a little photo, a box of histories and secrets. It was a shoebox with an iPhone inside, and it was a way to record students' memories of their migrations and their movements in the neighborhood. What made this work possible is a wide and expansive network of contacts that the Museo of Antioquia had made in that community. Community leaders opened their doors to the historic exploration of community memory, thanks to the trust built with the museum and their community organizing work. So how to support practices that rely on extradisciplinary strategies and operate on this one-to-one scale. These kinds of practices organize communities, but are left to generate their own life-sustaining worlds, and they operate very often outside of the art world's purview. For people like the director, Lucia Gonzalez, working in culture, while the region she's working in is still a region of conflict, created a mandate to focus on memory recuperation, civic and civic reintegration issues, but also focus on community organizing. Other examples of this kind of leadership is seen in the work of Tom Finkelpearl, who served for 12 years as the director of the Queen's Museum in New York. While serving as director, he hired community organizers with strong ties to South America to emphasize the diversity of the new immigrant population of Queens. Both the Museo de Antioquia and Queen's Museum have that in common, focusing on communities and organizing tactics that attract artists who work in those methodologies and challenge the aesthetic paradigms of what we know art can do in public. It is this capacity that allows these institutions to navigate a form of practice that would create impossible challenges for most museums. Plus, the added benefit of properly addressing and representing its constituency. I hope to, I've probably thrown out a lot of information, but I hope to bring up some of these topics in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you very much.